Welcome back to the Fitness, Wellness, and Longevity Podcast. Today, my guest was Ian Kaplan. Ian is a third-year chiropractic student at Keiser University. He is also a fitness coach and a fitness enthusiast himself. Ian works with many different athletes, including high-level teen athletes in the sport of fitness. He just got back from the Granite Games, where his athlete, Sina Eriksson, placed 7th place among some of the best teens in the world. He is going to be heading out to the CrossFit Games in the coming months to coach another teen athlete. But along with that, Ian has a wealth of knowledge in all things health related, as he is a chiropractic student. He has a very unique outlook on things as someone who is probably one of the most well-read and educated people that I've ever come across in my entire life. Guys, give this podcast a chance. You're going to be amazed at how intelligent and inspiring this conversation really is, especially as we get toward the end in terms of the pain paradigm that people experience. You're going to be shocked at what you think your pain is and how we actually alleviate it. Guys, if you like this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review, and enjoy my conversation with Ian Kaplan. Hello there. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night. What's up, Ian?
Nothing much. What's going on with you?
Thank you very much for coming down to the brand new CrossFit Delray Beach recording studio here in Delray Beach, Florida. What do you think? Are you blown away?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome, Ian. So, Ian, you just got back down from Minnesota, correct?
Yep, the Granite Games.
Yeah. So, for those of us at home who don't know what the Granite Games are, what are the Granite Games, and why were you there?
So the Granite Games is a CrossFit sanctioned event, new to this year in St. Cloud, Minnesota. It's a 3 or 4 day event, depending on what division you're in. And it's one of the larger competitions on the circuit right now. And I was there because it has one of the few competitive teenage 16 to 18 divisions. So I had an athlete, Sina Eriksson, compete in that age group category with 9 other individuals over the course of the weekend.
Nice. And had this been the first time you went to the Granite Games?
Yep. That was the first time in St. Cloud.
First off, how did you like Minnesota in the end of May / beginning of June?
It was nice. It was way better than when I was in there in October.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Were you up there earlier in the year?
Yeah, for the Chiropractic Sports Council Symposium thing, which is in Minneapolis.
So, before we go to that, because I'd like to learn more about that, tell us how the weekend went.
The weekend was good. You kind of go into those weekends kind of knowing where you sit because there's a small group of competitors in that age group, so you kind of know generally what events people are going to do well and what people are going to not do so well, and it's just about executing your ability on that weekend. I think that's what Sina did, and definitely learned a lot. And outside of that, the event was really good. It was very well run. The venue is really nice. The environment was really good. Lots of good, a lot of people who you learn, who's who in the space, and you get to kind of become friendly with were there. So it's good to see those people again. And and kind of the pros or the big dogs competition was exciting to watch and pretty accessible for people. So that was just an added bonus.
Nice. And as a coach at one of these competitions, fairly high-level athletes, what is your role at this point?
So in person at the competition?
Correct.
So after all the preparation is done? I think ideally it's more hands-off than a lot of coaches like to be. I think if you've done a good job of preparing the athlete, they feel confident going into the event, and they feel like they can know what to do when they can roll with the chaos and the changes and the unexpected things that come up, and they feel prepared for those things. So I think your role as a coach, whether it's in the warm-up area or watching the event, is simply to kind of be a sounding board for the athlete and be there for support and provide an additional level of comfort as opposed to dictating too much, because those competition weekends are really based on how the athlete feels and kind of like you're not in there in their shoes essentially. So all you can do is ask them questions and allow them to really get a better sense of who they are and what they're capable of over that weekend. So you're just trying to facilitate that. And then when they're out there on the competition floor, you just get to enjoy the performance. And of course, you're nervous and things might not go well, and you kind of have to let go of that. And I think that's a big mistake coaches make is especially in this sport, they like try to motivate their athlete on the competition floor, which ends up just not sitting well with me. There's nothing you can do once they're out there. It's kind of like tennis. It's like you're not allowed to communicate with them in tennis. But yeah, and then afterwards it's kind of just reflection and helping the athlete move on to the following event and helping kind of manage the weekend if they forget things or if because you're a more objective third party, just to keep everything on track and running smoothly.
What is your mental preparation like prior to one of these events? Because it almost seems, as in speaking to you about that, there's a lot more like harm than you can do good at this point, right? So how do you become mentally prepared for a competition like this?
How does the coach become mentally prepared for the weekend?
Correct.
I think ideally you should do the same thing that your athlete is doing, which is set goals and expectations for the weekend for yourself. And when you know them for the athlete, you become more comfortable with the outcomes of the weekend, right? You make, reasonable, achievable, goals, and the expectations are usually process oriented. So am I aligning with the behaviors that I set out to basically kind of establish for myself, or am I deviating from those behaviors? And you just have to periodically reflect on that in the morning and possibly in the evening, because there is downtime, and just be comfortable with whatever happens and know, this is part of a long journey for you and for the athletes. The athletes are coaching, right? This weekend doesn't make or break anything, and performance, and just like for the athlete, you're not defined by your performance. And it's sometimes even harder for the coach, because the coach feels, like not only is their identity as an athlete defined by their performance, but, it's the way they make money or their professional reputation. They feel like they can be defined by an athlete's performance, which is under even more outside of their control than for the athlete. So you have to be comfortable with knowing that that's part of the game, and that it's all part of the game, and just, and that's what you signed up for.
So you had mentioned a little bit of how you keep track of and you check in. But are there any other ways? Are there any other people that you kind of interact with in order for you to kind of be able to tell whether or not you are in this fixing place or more in that flow state? Or is that something that you've kind of picked up over time, coaching athletes and coaching this athlete in particular?
What do you mean by check in with people?
So for me personally, I have like kind of trusted people who I talk to, who I can kind of bounce ideas off of. And some of them are mentors. Some of them are just close personal friends, to kind of, because I can only see what I can see. So almost like that idea of am I really in the right headspace right now? Or am I actually coming from a place of self-centeredness, kind of, so to speak?
Yeah. That's a tough question, because I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. And I imagine I've checked in with you just unconsciously, and other coaches that I consider peers and colleagues, I guess, play that role. Even though I don't think I've ever consciously set out to check my strategy. But I think you do that with the athlete too, and try to understand where they're sitting, cognitively and emotionally, and if maybe you're contributing to that. And because you can always course correct in the middle of any sort of, event. So there's always an opportunity to change direction if you notice, if you happen to notice it. But always trying to notice it and not just allowing things to happen can also be paralyzing. So I think there's almost the inevitability that you make what seem like mistakes, but that's how you right, improve the next opportunity in this iterative process. And that's okay, and because it might not even be a real meaningful mistake, it might not actually have contributed negatively to any performance. It just might be something you would do differently the next time. So that's one of the big learning opportunities of being there in person with an athlete competing in a multi-day sport like this, I think. So like we're both going to make, so like both the coach and the athlete are going to make mistakes. The athlete gets to see their mistakes kind of play out in front of them and probably has a better opportunity to learn more immediately. But those mistakes probably hurt a little more, and they're a little more direct. It's like if I feel like I said something wrong or could have warmed up better, we both know that. We both know that's part of why we're there and part of the long-term progression. So it's like you get another opportunity like that, you do something differently, and maybe you end up with the same result, maybe you don't. But that's the uncertainty.
What inspires you to do this?
This specifically, or
yeah. So I mean, obviously, I would, it's hard to be like, what inspires you in life? No, what inspires you to coach athletes? Number one, and number two, what inspires you to coach athletes specifically? And then for those who are listening to this and without the knowledge of things like CrossFit and stuff, the sport of fitness. What inspires you to coach athletes and coach athletes in the sport of fitness?
Okay, so coaching athletes, especially in like the strength and conditioning and fitness context, because
Correct.
coaching in general is there's a lot of different things that fall under the category of coaching. I think coaching people is it's such a complicated puzzle. And again, there's so much uncertainty and so much to learn. And the challenge of integrating knowledge into practice is a really interesting problem that kind of has both an art and a science. And the art is in applying the science, which I said before. And that kind of ties into why I like clinical practice too, because it's a similar challenge. I think clinical practice is coaching people in pain, right? So it's really about coaching. But so that's probably the most succinct way I can define that. And coaching athletes in general, I think the pursuit of mastery, the pursuit of physical potential is a really meaningful thing to help someone with. And that idea of doing this for a really long time to figure out where your potential is and always be, helping people move in the direction of that potential, and kind of we can be honest with where people sit in that direction and in a relative and absolute sense. And so there's just a lot of truth in there. And then in the sport of fitness in general, it's just a really chaotic sport with a lot of moving parts, just like people, are really chaotic with a lot of moving parts. And to sort out kind of the order from the chaos is, again, a really interesting challenge. Because there are simple sports that are challenging in their own right, or relatively simple sports. But when you deal with complexity on so many levels, like in CrossFit, because you're basically combining a bunch of sports into some sort of an organized framework, but that framework is constantly evolving, that becomes an ever-evolving challenge that, again, there's like so much room for creativity within that to figure out best practices for people. And on every individual case, it's a learning experience, and no two people are the same, no two events are the same, right? And and even the same person at a similar event will be a totally different experience with something to learn from. So there's kind of no light at the end of the tunnel, which is really kind of interesting to me and fascinating, and seems like it will never get stale.
Yeah, that could definitely be a double-edged sword of the pursuit of, virtuosity versus gratitude for what is, right? Do you think that that's part of coaching? And if so, how do you balance the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes into some sports psychology frameworks of trying to understand perfectionism and how it can be positive and negative depending on how it's framed. So it seems like striving for perfectionism is different than expecting perfectionism. So if you're always kind of working towards mastery, but kind of know it's a impossible goal, but you're excited about the improvement in the game and figuring out the puzzle in front of you, then it becomes empowering. But if you expect to be at a certain level and you're not, then it becomes discouraging. Right? It's a relative negative experience every time. So as long as it's framed appropriately, embracing that uncertainty and that kind of never-ending pursuit can be really meaningful. Because if it was finite and achievable, then at some point you'd be done. And then and if you could be done, you can kind of turn that on its head. It's like, what's the point of doing it if it was easily achievable?
Yeah, definitely.
And also, how could you do it better, than how, so if the point is to do it better, whether you're motivated by doing better than others, which is fine for some people, but by doing it to the best of your ability, if there's a possibility, if all you can really do is do it to the best of your ability, then that can sit well as enough. Right, because then the pursuit is just to do it better than how you've been doing it previously.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the challenges that you see? Because you've coached a high level teen athlete. What are some of the bigger challenges you've seen in coaching a high level teen athlete? Because that is, I imagine, a profoundly different experience than coaching, let's say, an elite open athlete and even a masters athlete, which I've had a great deal of experience doing.
Mm-hmm.
What is your perspective and what is your journey thus far been for a coach who has focused most of their sport of fitness coaching on teen athletes?
I think it's interesting because I also don't have as much experience with masters, or I do have some experience with masters level, and open category athletes, but not at the same level.
Mm-hmm.
I think what has proved meaningful for teen athletes in general, and just speaking to a bunch of them over time, because I think seen as an exception in a lot of ways to typical teen athletes. And maybe there isn't a teen archetype yet, but it seems like just in conversation with a lot of them and relatively kind of deep conversation about their aspirations in the sport, there's a lot of, it's hard to deal with the combination of low training age and talent to help them buy into a long-term approach.
Mm-hmm.
And they might be initially motivated by that talent and by what other people perceive as their potential, and the road to their potential might be much longer than the people around them, and as a consequence they realize, and it might be more useful for them to actually delay their progress to achieve a higher peak potential later in their career, because we don't really know what those careers look like for people who start the sport so young, because it's a young sport, and start competing at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a success story with Cena, because I don't think she would be as, again, this imagining a counterfactual that hasn't happened, but I don't think she would be in the same place in terms of her ability if she was good enough when she was 15 to qualify for the CrossFit Games. I think we've had that conversation. I think she would say that too.
So how does that conversation go? And at what point do you have that conversation of saying, listen, I understand that you are looking around and you're seeing a lot of different athletes having success. And I know you have a great deal of talent, yet you see something in a bigger picture. How do you have that conversation? And when do you have that conversation with the athlete?
Well, I think it comes with disappointment and loss early on. I think the exposure to that.
Do you think that's an important part of this?
Yeah. Because I think the worst thing that can happen, I said it before, the worst thing that can happen is you get everything you ever wanted as early as possible. Because then it becomes easy to be extrinsically motivated. And this is a hard sport to be extrinsically motivated in.
Can you elaborate on that, being extrinsically motivated?
That means, right, if you're,
and also in regards to this sport.
Imagine a young, it happens for 20-something-year-olds, but imagine a young teenager who gets all of a sudden gets all this a gold medal around his or her neck and all this PR and sponsors and the praise of her parents and his parents and all of their friends, and becomes the CrossFit Games champion or the Wodapalooza champion. And now their identity is wrapped up in not only CrossFit, but their ability to win at CrossFit. So then everything they do is oriented around the reward they experience and the attention they get from competing and winning in the sport. And then it becomes a problem in the sense that it's hard to sustain that. And if at some point, which is likely that they lose because it's hard to win everything forever in the sport, the fear that it all might go away can become crippling. And then once you feel that slipping, it can be easy to lose all motivation to train because you never actually had, training never was an end in itself because of that. Right.
Yeah.
And I think the best athletes are motivated to train because they enjoy training, and they actually get a better response from training because of that, because they're actually more engaged in the training. Right. Because I think training to win is useful at a certain point for stress and adaptation to competition, but training to win actually disconnects you from the process of training. Right. Because there's adaptations that you need to get in training that come from enjoyment and engagement in the process of the activity, and not from trying to suffer to sacrifice to win.
What are some strategies that you use to ensure that the athletes that you're working with are getting that message?
Well, we talked about, I think exposure to competition, because everyone will lose except for a handful of the most talented people in the world. So you don't really work with the people who win all the time. You have to struggle that with. So they compete and they lose, and then you kind of reflect on what the purpose of that is. And then it becomes clear over time they can't do this to win, because most people don't win. So I've never actually had the challenge of telling someone who's won all the time that it's not about winning. But I think that is done in training, right? By framing training in a way that it is that structured work becomes as like unstructured play as possible, that it becomes about movement solutions and about finding ways to find success in training, and learning that failure is just a step towards success, and allowing people to fail safely and comfortably, and then building confidence over time and the sense of comfort with that vulnerability, right? So comfort in physical discomfort, but also comfort in the discomfort of the possibility of not achieving kind of the outcome that you thought, right? And I think that's done in training, and framing training in the right way, and having intent in training, but not necessarily kind of this sense that training needs to be suffering.
So there has to be play.
Yeah, and training has to be play. Training has to be enjoyable in that way, and discomfort can be enjoyable if it's contextualized the right way.
So how do you create play in a sport where it's mostly suffering?
Well, I think people make suffering play because they like to do the work in a way that maximizes, efficiency and speed ultimately, right? To win the race, but to win the race as efficiently as possible with the best recovery possible. Right, so it's about mastery of the race, and the race changes all the time, which is what the play is.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So say you have an athlete who's like, all right, we need to get better at aerobic power. And for those of you who are listening, who are like, what the hell is aerobic power?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say it's the ability for a person to sustain power output.
Mm-hmm.
Or a sustainable power output. So we're thinking like something over a minute long, where like a mile run, a 2K row, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you make something like that play? Obviously, it's very easy when you're doing a sport like lacrosse, football, basketball, where you can play games within the sport to elicit the adaptation of skill acquisition. But how do you do that in a sport of fitness?
Yeah, I think it's hard because some people might never enjoy it.
Yeah.
It might be challenging for some people, but on the other hand, some people are just compulsive and obsessive. Like, I can do the next interval better. I can optimize this. I love putting in the work. I love tightening everything up, and and they see the improvement over time as enough reward in itself. If I think I've been lucky to have people like that I coach. So that's so cultivating that ultimately is the goal. So if people don't necessarily have that, you can talk to people about that. It's like, hey, the point of these intervals is I want to see you make them as tight as possible while making them feel as sustainable as possible. And it's like, how are you going to do that? And let them kind of autonomously figure that out, so they can feel like they're improving their competence at and connecting it to the sport. It's like, yeah, this is going to make you, improve your breathing, improve your recovery, improve your ability to hold paces in events, and improve your ability to execute a 3-day weekend competition, because you need to be able to do a certain amount of aerobic activity, and the sport is mostly aerobic. So learning to really run your engine well translates really well to performance in the sport, and we can show that just based on relative data of high-level people. So once they're bought in, you can say, hey, this is the goal over time. We want to hold absolute paces that are relatively good for you, and we want to make them as tight as possible with as minimum deviation and as minimum effort as possible. So it's not only like, oh, I have to work really hard to adjust my pace all the time. Eventually it should just be natural to hold certain paces in certain gears.
Yeah, and I as the thunder starts to come outside, this is back-to-back days of just getting crushed by thunderstorms here in South Florida. But I mean, I understand the idea of adaptation and practice and that kind of thing, but does that feel like play to you?
It feels like a game. I don't know. I think we sometimes confuse play with other things.
Maybe I'm confusing play with and
I said structured work should be as like unstructured play as possible. Doesn't mean it's actually that close to unstructured play, depending on the task. So I was like, if something is really rigid and structured, it's hard to make it less structured, but you can move it in that direction with different focuses.
Okay. So like adjusting the mindset of the interval, it makes it more of a game.
Yeah. Yeah, and if people don't have those tools, it becomes monotonous and repetitive, and people often become disengaged from the task, and that limits their ability to adapt to it, right? So, and you don't really know if you're not asking questions and you're not getting feedback. So that's kind of how the training is not based on the task being executed. The task doesn't exist in isolation. It's really about the athlete's relationship and kind of navigation of the task that's being prescribed to them. So the task can't be considered independently of the athlete, right? So exercises aren't anything without the athlete doing them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And obviously, there's nuance to this conversation, but like for anybody who's sitting here listening to this podcast and saying, okay, so I have a very good example as the sport of fitness, as one of those things. It's like, I don't really want to suffer in this thing. It's challenging, whether it's that or studying for your LSATs or trying to maximize profit shares in a company or something like that.
Yeah.
It's about like kind of creating games, because I believe that, and obviously there's science to back this up, that when our minds are in a state of play, we're much more able to adapt. Our brains change much more easily. So I guess the challenge as a coach is to understand the task at hand well enough to start making it a game. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And that's kind of, that's the point, and that's how you help athletes that aren't the greatest athletes, because I think the greatest athletes do that, naturally on their own, and they've always done it. And if you have a great athlete, all you do is let them do that.
Yeah. So the other thought that I have, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is the fact that, so when you're in a state of play, you're probably not in a stressed state.
Yeah, it becomes, especially in this sport, it becomes more efficient.
Well, let's talk more about you jumped right to efficiency there, but when you're not in a stressed state, you're able to kind of learn a little bit easier,
Yeah,
right?
and you can tolerate more training,
Okay. Why is that?
right? Because we accumulate stress in many ways, not just through mechanical loading, but also through cognitive effort and emotional responses. So the more you embody the stress of training, or the more stressful training kind of appears to you, the less training you'll be able to execute appropriately, which is kind of a key performance indicator for the sport, is the ability to tolerate training, right? Basically as much training as possible relative to the demands of the sport at the level you're competing at.
And so obviously this is a fairly deep conversation in the nuances of training and game theory and all that kind of stuff.
Complex systems.
Mm-hmm. And it may be beyond the scope of those listening, though. Yeah. People who are listening may actually be into this. But let's try to boil this down a little bit and try to take some of this and apply it to, let's say, a novice. Mm-hmm. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who is, let's say, a 3 to 4 time a week gym member, whether they are in a CrossFit or any other kind of training? How do we apply that to our own training based upon the things that you've learned of adaptation of individuals?
Okay, so I think the main takeaway is that adaptation is unpredictable and uncertain in both magnitude and direction, meaning you don't really know how you're going to respond to training, and you can't really predict it, right? And people are not reducible to, I'm a training machine, right? You're an emotional person with, learned behaviors and abilities and kind of an experience. So all we can do is say, you have a task in front of you and you're going to do it to the best of your ability on that day. And if that's not rewarding to you, either because it's connected to your ability to move for long periods of time, or to feel better throughout the day, or if you have aspirations of competing and connecting to your potential as an athlete, then that activity is probably not worthwhile for you to do that day. Right? So that's how you manage your own training and recovery. Because if you're not motivated to train, then you might not be getting that might be a leading indicator of essentially that you're not doing what's required either inside the gym or outside of the gym to get the most out of your training. And maybe your training might have to be different, or maybe your behavior might have to be different. Again, we don't really know, and we have to kind of play a trial and error game with that.
Is that more of the individual's mindset thing, or is that more of a environmental
right?
deal?
I think when we talk about that stuff, we need to appreciate that those things influence each other. That people sometimes blame their thoughts as if they're from a kind of a disembodied mind, but those thoughts are the product of a person that doesn't have a driver in their head who turns the lights on and off. Those are the products of a irreducible person, right? So you might be having those thoughts because you're tired, or because the training isn't appropriate, or because a number of things, because of sleep or lifestyle factors can be wearing you down, or those thoughts can be influencing in the other direction. So the question is, where do you intervene? And I think the answer is you intervene on as many of the levels as you can.
And
right, to push people in the direction that they want to go, which is usually improved performance if you're talking about an athlete, or and also you have to define what the goal is with the person, because if they're kind of dabbling, then they don't really have a direction, so they might not actually ever achieve the direction that they're expecting. So if they're actually just doing it to look better, to feel better, then that dictates different behavior than to perform well in the sport, because there's a certain amount of stress that you tolerate to tolerate a stressful sport.
What do you what's a recommendation on individuals who are still trying to discern their goals? Do you have
Um,
any advice or strategies that you would use on not only yourself but athletes to determine goals?
um, that's a good question. Um, I think I think the classic question is, if people don't have hard goals, you can begin to suggest goals and see if those resonate with people. I
Mm.
think you can also ask what people are already doing now because usually people align their behavior with what's important to them.
Whether they know it or not.
Yeah, whether they know it or not. And that's kind of a motivational interviewing technique is like, how are you manifesting what you believe is important to you in your life? And then once they consciously recognize that, they might be able to articulate their goals better. I think that works for most people. And also you can start, and a lot of times people maybe tell themselves that they have a goal that they really don't have, and then all you can do as a coach is help them in that direction. And then if it's really, you know misaligned and create some sort of dissonance, then you'll at some point you'll be able to see that. And as long as you have a good uh, line of communication, you can change course when the person's behavior continues not to line up with that goal, because that's usually what won't happen. They won't consciously say, "Oh, I don't actually want this." It'll take experiences and might take a long time. And I think patience is probably the number one thing to consider, because it might take a really long time to figure that out. And then but once that's clear, it becomes even easier to really align things. So it could take a very long time for a person to realize, man, this is actually what I want, especially in exercise, because people are pulled into exercise via unsustainable marketing typically. So it's like, achieve this fast,
Do you have
look
any
at this.
personal examples or examples for with those that you've worked with of like working through to find people's goals?
Uh, yeah, because I think all you do is you ask them what they want out of an exercise program, and I think if they're paying a coach, they usually want something, you know. And if they can't articulate it, well, it's like, do you want the typical things? Do you want to, improve your body composition and feel better, or are you kind of interested in sport participation, or are you interested in both? That's an interesting conversation, or you're just interested in doing better at your job. Like there's a bunch of things, and then I think all you can do is meet them where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because it's really ultimately your job just to support them in what they say they want, and not fight them at every turn, because that can create some resistance. So again, as long as you're okay with that, and there is the possibility that they blame you when they reach kind of the point where they realize that their goals don't align with their behavior. But I think if you've created enough trust and communication, that doesn't happen. That they're like, okay, I'm ready to move on. Like, and they might get the sense that you're not really supportive, or it's like, I think that might not be a good idea. But like sometimes it happens. It's like, hey, may I have some other ideas? Um, or it's like, I think the best way to frame it is, do you want to do something different? When they get to that point, and if when they own that decision, also I think it becomes more meaningful to them. So you've actually taken longer, just like you've taken longer for an athlete's development, you've taken longer for a non-athlete's kind of personal development.
Mm-hmm.
But you once you've arrived there, you've really learned something important.
Yeah.
So I think thinking on larger time scales, which is easier to do in an individual coaching model, than a lot of typical fitness services, because fitness services typically turn over people very fast, so they don't have the opportunity to learn anything.
Yep.
Once they don't achieve something, they blame the service and they move on to the next thing. So once you get people who are bought in for long periods of time, it becomes a lot easier, because all you do is meet them where they are, and the communication over time organically gets people to where they want to be.
Can you talk a little bit about one of the things you had mentioned, which is having conversations with people in terms of the balance of performance and aesthetics? And I imagine that as a fitness coach, coaching very high level athletes, that is a conversation that ends up happening.
Yeah, I think it's hard to generalize that. but I think people are always attached to a certain level of, even if they're really interested in performance, they're attached to a certain level of leanness, or they associate an appearance with a performance. And I think with people who are connected more to performance, you just need to continue to connect it to performance. Right. You need to ask them if they're improving, and if they are, then what's the conversation about? You know, and if they show improvement over time, but they are on some level unhappy with their body composition, then the conversation becomes, is like, what would it take for you to be happy with your body composition? And is that achievable? And if you ask them that, and they usually give an answer of, I don't know, and probably not, as long as and it's okay to have the thoughts of disappointment in your body composition, but as long as you bring it back to, that's not really my focus right now. It could be my focus in the future, and that could be a different pursuit. But right now, the focus is on performance. And on the flip side, you can have that opposite conversation. But I think for general, kind of people who aren't super high level athletes, the conversation can be about balancing the two. But then the conversation has to be longer term. It's like, hey, we're not going to try to lose weight as fast as possible. We're not going to try to perform, well in a competition as early as possible. We're going to do what you feel like you can do for the rest of your life, and you're always going to see improvement in both directions. Just the relative progress would be slower than doing one or the other 100%. And I think that's fine for people who are essentially kind of in it for the long game, again with an individualized coach, because they've pre-selected that service, and they're not in a 12-week weight loss challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So they've already understood that I'm doing this. They've usually done that already and not experienced results. And so they've already pre-selected to be open to the idea that kind of I would need to work a little harder for what I actually want, which is a balance of improved body composition and performance.
What's your recipe for better body composition for individuals? What is usually your first step when a person comes to you and says, I want to look better naked?
I think the first step is establishing consistency and routine, and whatever it looks like for the person. So there's no nutrition prescription. The exercise prescription is focused around consistency, is what they can do week to week and feel good about accomplishing no matter what's in their life. And then beginning to develop routine around their life in general. And you focus on basic kind of first principles of nutrition, which is, hydration and eating, similar quality meals in terms of amount, but variation in the specifics of the food. And, and the basics, chewing your food, plenty of vegetables. And what goes into those meals is a little less relevant early on. But once they've really established those habits, that's often enough just to continue on a slow trend of progress over a very long period of time. And that's really, I think, what the training program creates for them. It's engagement in a consistent process. So for them, it's also about an enjoyable training experience, so that they can feel good about being consistent over time. Right? If it crushes them and they feel like they need to rest, or if it becomes overly monotonous and feels like a burden, it becomes less conducive to consistency over a very long period of time, right? Because if you can't see yourself doing it forever, then you won't do it very long.
And when a individual comes to you and says, like, listen, I don't have much of a training background, I really don't know what I like, what is your strategy in that case?
That doesn't really happen.
Really? In terms of the athletes and the individuals that you've coached thus far, usually it's some people who have some kind of training history already.
Yeah, I think it's possible to work with those people, but I think people usually try the cheapest offering, or the lowest cost offering first, and then they move up kind of pricing tiers.
Mm-hmm.
And people aren't necessarily attracted to a service paradigm that puts a lot of the ownership on them, which is what's necessary for long-term growth, but requires a certain orientation that's usually developed through some experience in fitness.
Okay, so they have to kind of go through some processes
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
to be able to discern what it is they want
I think
versus
it
what they
takes
don't want.
I think it takes a very kind of self-aware and organized individual to start in fitness and say I'm interested in long-term progress only, and I understand that I can make rapid short-term progress at the expense of long-term progress. So I'm gonna forego that
Yeah.
because that's not what humans do typically. So it takes an exceptional individual to do that.
Yep.
Um, but I imagine that will be more common as people kind of notice the experience of people around them, if they are that astute to say, man, my friends or my family aren't really succeeding in this fitness thing. Maybe I need to do something different than them. Like they can learn from the failures of those around them. That would be an awesome person to work with because those people probably, are very easy to reason with and to kind of come to a consensus with.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. So, Ian, I'd be remiss to talk about the fact that you are a chiropractic student right now, right?
Mhm.
Chiropractic medicine, is that the correct way of saying it? Or
At Keiser it is, but the degree is Doctor of Chiropractic still. Yeah, third year student.
okay, and
Yeah.
how much time? How long is a chiropractic degree take?
It's a 4-year program, but we do it in 3 years and 4 months.
Okay, so you are in your third year, so you are coming up into that like about 1 year left,
Just less than 1 year left.
just less than 1 year. Okay, cool. So
So in the final year.
I would
Yeah.
say that you are a relative authority in talking about at least public health and related topics. Would you agree?
Sure.
Okay.
More, I would say more than a lot of practitioners who aren't as aware of the primary literature as I am.
Okay.
Because a lot of people, the day they finish school is the day they stop learning, unfortunately.
Yes. And obviously in the field that you're in, and in knowing you, I know that you're not, the buck doesn't stop when you get your chiropractic, doctorate. You are going to be then, pursuing, further on. What does that look like for you?
As I mentioned it earlier, I think good evidence-based care is coaching, because it ultimately becomes about perspective and conversation and creating a positive experience and a plan and ultimately hope, and not making unsubstantiated claims, right, which is rampant in conservative musculoskeletal care, right?
So not only chiropractic
Yeah,
work.
about you can't make claims about what you can and can't do, what mechanisms are and aren't present, because most of those are unestablished until you have great evidence to suggest that your intervention at the exclusion of other interventions is useful for a specific person at a specific time. To create those narratives for people is ultimately limiting, at least in my opinion, is limiting. And there's some evidence to suggest that when you create those narratives that are ultimately dependent on the clinician, that you actually reduce, favorable outcomes. So the question that a lot of people who are familiar with the evidence arrive at is, if I can't say these things or these things aren't as useful as I thought they were, or they're not more useful than anything else, right? If it's all non-specific, then what do I do? Well, the answer is coaching. The answer is you can do a lot of things, but as long as you empower the individual, you give them the tools to self-manage, you make them autonomous and competent, and you improve their relationships with you and those around them, right? That's self-determination theory. That's kind of, I think, a key to helping people become more intrinsically motivated to participate, or to basically take charge of their care and their progression, ultimately their potential, which is kind of the road of clinical practice to rehab to performance. Then you have best practices, because no one intervention is necessarily better than the other, because it depends on the person. And active interventions are always better than passive interventions. And I think the story we tell and the perspective we can impart on people is if not everything, it's the bulk of the value we deliver.
Ian, You are going to be representing the chiropractic community right now, and I'm going to put you over the fire.
I don't want to do that.
Chiropractic work doesn't get the best rap often.
Deservedly so.
Deservedly so. Okay, cool. So obviously, we are not in opposition when it comes to a lot of the unsubstantiated claims that chiropractic work does. Yeah. However, I kind of alluded to it earlier, is do you feel that there's also that running rampant in other relatively, well accepted versions of medicine these days?
Sure.
Let's say an allopathic, and even let's say things like physical therapy, etc.
Yeah, I mean, we have just as good evidence to suggest that common orthopedic surgical procedures are, if not mostly entirely, mediated by placebo effects or nonspecific effects. Meaning, if you did a fake surgery, people get just as better.
Yeah, I believe I heard that long ago with like meniscal repair or something like that.
And there was a recent study in the Lancet on subacromial impingement or subacromial pain syndrome decompression surgeries, which is surgery with very good outcomes. But they had a very large, for a surgical trial, very well controlled study, and the no intervention group did very well, and the placebo group did just as well as the intervention group. So it's multiple surgeries, and also there was a good, systematic review that had NIH participants and a bunch of hospital participants. It was across multiple surgeries, multiple sites, and the data suggested that almost all surgeries related to pain were mostly, if not entirely, mediated by placebo effects. So those are, and there's other evidence to suggest that the larger the procedure and the more the patient perceives the significance of the procedure, the more placebo they experience. So that's one mechanism by which surgeries related to pain are real for the patient, but likely governed by non-specific effects and not tissue-specific effects.
But Ian, I'm in pain, and the doctor said I need surgery.
Yeah, and you might actually need surgery, but the mechanism by which you reduce pain might not be the one you think. So there might be other ways so the surgery itself might not be contributing to the process of recovery as much as the forced rest and the rehabilitation, right? Or time, right? The natural history of pain might be contributing. Regression to the mean effects, meaning statistically, some people just do better than other people, and you might actually be able to control how well you do, might be contributing to some of it. And right, pain is complicated, and one of the current understandings of pain that captures much more of pain than simple mechanical driven nociception, meaning like bad sensation from tissue that is dysfunctional or damaged, is that we're in pain because it's adaptive and we predict we're in pain. Right? We have a learned experience of pain that serves a purpose, and we then manifest that condition as, right, an irreducible organism, right, as an adaptive creature.
Are you saying that we might be addicted to our pain, Ian?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily, it's not because it's all in your head, it's because that's how we resolve essentially prediction error, is that we're always perceiving our environment, and we have these experiences that are, in our memory that left an imprint, and we're always trying to reconcile our experience with our sensory input, and to sift through that noise and to make sense of our world. We sometimes experience pain because it served us in the past.
Okay.
So that's a very complex process, and we can't necessarily consciously intervene with that. But all the tools we use to intervene in a painful scenario might be either intervening on the level of reducing the sensory input or changing the likelihood that we predict we're in pain. It either changes the interpretation of the sensory input or it changes the sensory input itself, but both are equally real to the patient. And in very few situations, if, in terms of chronic pain, do we really know which one is more meaningful? Reducing the afferent or towards the brain sensory input that something is diseased or broken, or the kind of the systemic interpretation of environment of one is threatening. Right? We can either de-threaten the person or remove the threat. often we do both, and we don't know which one is
Yep.
actually reducing the pain.
So that's what we're seeing in medical intervention with, let's say, surgery, like we mentioned
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
Have you ever?
But often we don't, if we don't remove the threat because it's not a real threat.
Yeah,
but
because
we remove the threat perception.
yes,
Then we reduce the pain. Right?
yes.
The threat is imagined most of the time.
So yeah, and this is something that I'm not 100% sure if you know who I'm talking about, but he's actually a doctor of chiropractic, Dr. Joe Dispenza. Have you ever heard that name?
It sounds familiar.
So Dr. Joe Dispenza is big into the mixture of science and the world of self-care and self-improvement, let's say. So his theory in terms of pain is in terms of us as organisms, we are so highly evolved in terms of our prefrontal cortex and our ability to think. We can put ourselves in positions where we were in pain, remember that, and then actually feel those pains.
Yeah. I think a good
Does that fall kind of in line with what you're saying?
Because I think we falsely think that our perception of our current environment is an accurate reflection of reality. But there's a couple ways that are clearly we can illustrate how that's not true. One like our vision is whatever 10 milliseconds behind reality. So we actually perceive the world slightly in the past.
So what you're saying there is we interpret what we're seeing is an interpretation of our brain.
Yeah, our conscious, perception of the world has been pre-filtered by a nervous system that fills in all of the gaps, and it fills in the gaps based on our experience and and contextual factors and what's kind of socially instilled as implicit in our environment. Right? It makes predictions about what is likely, and then manifest that as certain. Right? So that reduces noise because you might have two conflicting signals. It's going to pick one of those signals with a higher prediction value based on experience or based on overriding kind of sensory input. So which one is a more powerful signal versus which one is a more powerful prediction? And we're always making those kind of determinations.
Yep.
And we just need to alter that calculus in terms of, at least that's a computational model of thinking about it. There might be a better model that we think of at some point. But it's not the utterly broken model that pain is nociception. That pain is just bad sensation. Because people have plenty of pain without any bad sensation. And that might be a component, and you might simply resolve some pain by reducing the sensation, by ablating nerves, by cutting limbs off. But often you don't. Even by cutting limbs off, you don't resolve the pain in the limb, which is phantom limb syndrome.
Yeah. So for those of you out there right now who want to try this, hit your finger with a hammer and then chop that finger off. You're probably going to feel that finger still in pain.
Yeah.
So actually bringing this full circle, I have a great question for you is knowing that, what is your, and this could be a conversation all in itself, and maybe it will be eventually when perhaps we cross paths again on the Fitness, Wellness, and Longevity podcast, but what is your predictive model of limitations when it comes to pain in the sport of fitness? Because we know that it is not just the feelings and sensations of your body.
Yeah.
We know that it's part of your brain perceiving that pain.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile all of that, and what is your thoughts right now as that will evolve, I'm sure, over time?
Yeah. I think of, right, pain is a very heterogeneous thing in fitness, because there can be like mechanical pain, there can be, metabolic pain. So I think those are the two big buckets that people experience. And I think they might require slightly different things, but I think ultimately we need to think of pain as a vital sense-making process that appraises threat. So meaning so people fear pain, or people react negatively to pain, or they associate pain with damage or with imminent catastrophe. And we need to kind of do some cognitive behavioral therapy to expose people to that and show them that that's not necessarily true, right? That pain doesn't indicate things, but they can use pain to improve their level of performance. There is a point where too much pain is bad and creates trauma and creates fear. But that's where we get graded exposure and contextualization and making sure the dose is appropriate for the person's tolerability. So as long as it's tolerable, as long as people recover well from it, as people can contextualize it in that way and use it to improve performance, then pain is as meaningful and valuable as anything else in performance. And it's also not, and pain reduction is not necessarily the goal of any sort of training intervention. To the point of zero experience of pain.
So it's interesting because
I would frame it more appropriately as discomfort.
Because we kind of see the best in the world, like, oh, they can deal with pain so much more. They get into the suck and they just keep going. Do you think maybe part of it is the fact that they just are able to take in the input and they don't actually elicit that stress response from the pain, which then almost allows them to complete the task without the deleterious effects of this pain perception, right?
Yeah, I think that's what we talk about with our mutual friend James Fitzgerald's model of low perception, high resilience. Is that yes, they can tolerate a bunch of chaos, without it just breaking them down, but also they don't unnecessarily filter or react to that experience in ways that are unnecessarily stressful or exceedingly stressful. They use it to inform either subcortical or cortical decision making, kind of intra-effort and also between efforts. So that's how they do it better, and they probably naturally do it. And we don't really know to what level they experience pain the same as other people, because people have, totally individual and unique experiences of pain, in terms of magnitude and quality and tolerance for duration. And I think that's demonstrated in a lot of pain literature too, is that people rate pain differently. People rate the exact same stimulus differently. If you change certain environmental factors or instill certain beliefs or behaviors, they then rate pain differently. So to objectify a quintessentially subjective experience is impossible. So all we can really do is kind of help guide a person in managing their experience better. That's in a goal-directed way.
That's a pretty profound, purpose when it comes to coaching.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a nice segue into your, into introducing some of the things that you do, Ian. Obviously, you coach fitness athletes, but can you kind of go over the things that you do on a personal basis, along with obviously being a chiropractic student?
What do you mean on a personal basis?
In your profession that you're unfolding in your own business as well.
I think the simplest answer is I coach people one-on-one in performance, and when I have a clinical doctorate in kind of a rehab to performance paradigm. Mm-hmm. So if they experience pain and limitation, we can train around the limitation, and I can give, as long as that is appropriately kind of diagnosed and managed by someone who has a license to do that, we can provide support and a path to return to performance while training around pain or injury. But for most people, it's about, they come with a goal and they want an individualized plan to achieve that. So that's always centered around a training program, but that's also ongoing conversation and consulting.
And I know that you coach athletes as well. Are you taking on clients right now, or?
Sure. Yep. Always.
Always. Okay. And if we are interested in your services, Ian, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
I have an Instagram, which I'm active on, Kaplan Fitness. That's my last name, Kaplan Fitness. That's probably the best way to reach me. You can also reach me at my email, which is ian.kaplan, same last name, 20 @gmail.com. Or you can find me at CrossFit Delray Beach.
And I know that you had a conversation with an athlete very recently, as pertaining to actually coaching a teen athlete at the CrossFit Games. What was the biggest selling point for her? Do you think, in terms of like, hey, wait a second, I've been kind of doing this on my own. Maybe you might be the one. What was the big selling point for them?
I think the selling point for individualized coaching in general is that the demands of a sport like CrossFit are clear. And if you're not training specifically for the sport, then you're not optimizing your training. And at a certain point, a lot of people recognize that training not only has to consider the demands of the sport, but also your current ability to basically execute and adapt to a certain level of training. So you have to bridge your current ability to the ability that required to participate, compete in, and excel at the sport. So that ultimately demands an individualized program. There are people that can self-organize on a group program and possibly do really well if that program is just designed to, kind of stress people so that they can one day handle the stress of the sport. But a lot of people can't. And also a lot of people can't do that forever. And a lot of people can't recognize when they're adapting and when they're not until it's too late. So I think that's the selling point for individualized coaching in general, because it's like, are you really going to roll the dice and see if you can kind of just, tolerate as much stress as possible, like some of the best people in the world just intuitively can, and possibly kind of burn yourself out or possibly not achieve what you want, or get an individualized plan that also that kind of is concerned with the demands of the sport, or that's centered around the demands of the sport, but also bridging your current demands to the demands of the sport. And then I think my message to her and to people in general was that I think then the question is, what is the best individualized program? What principles are within it? And I think ultimately we can't say specifically, and it's probably equifinal, or there's an equifinality to it, meaning there's multiple paths to the same, solution. So what's ultimately the best for an individual is the one that aligns athlete preferences and capacity with coach's preference and capacity, and is as adaptive as possible to the current state of the athlete, meaning it's responsive and there's a ton of communication, and it's basically flexibly non-linearly periodized, meaning it acknowledges the person as that irreducible complex organism with all of these kind of unpredictable, chaotic qualities. So all we can do is communicate and evaluate and appraise, status essentially, and manipulate training to best manage progression and kind of nudge the athlete in the direction of improved performance and adaptation that is required for the sport. So it's kind of managing, again, complexity in an athlete-centered way, which requires as much communication as the athlete and the coach can sustain, and as much flexibility, and also the kind of the production of autonomy and competence, essentially, that the athlete can learn to manage their own system and feel capable of doing that over time. So what that means is that if that's built into the program, then that, in a way that's not necessarily predictable, again, will push the athlete towards their potential, to their potential ability to execute the sport, right? Not their potential in general, but their specific potential, right? So if you want that potential, you need to kind of establish a training program and a relationship with ideally an impartial third party that allows you to learn how to experience that. If you can't just do it, which most people can't.
For sure. Mr. Ian Kaplan, thank you very much for being on the Fitness, Wellness, and Longevity podcast. Hopefully the next time that you're on the podcast, you will be Dr. Ian Kaplan. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you again to Ian Kaplan for sitting down and chatting with me. Like I said before, I'm sure that the next time that we talk in this podcast. He will be a doctor, which will be very, very cool. Guys, if you like today's podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. And we'll see you next time on the Fitness, Wellness, and Longevity Podcast.